I know that when you were in this position, and 5 points nationally ain't nothing, you are desperate for your allies to continue to communicate that you are the underdog, that it is, what was the old expression? I think Dan Rather used to call it tight as a tick, that there is no space for complacency. That said, the polls have to be a very encouraging sign inside the Harris campaign.
Well, the national poll, this particular one, is encouraging, certainly. I especially like the progress she's made on some pretty important issues to most voters, namely the economy, and how her favorability has ticked up. And I also like the enthusiasm that's recorded on her side of the equation. But having said that, national polls don't matter. Battleground state polls matter, and there's 7 of them. And just today, the same people that did this national poll pointed out that Trump is in a much better position in Arizona than she is, that Trump appears to be in a somewhat better position in Georgia than she is, that North Carolina is essentially tied. So we've got, and if you look at all of battleground states, if you add in Nevada and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, these are all margin of error races. We got 6 weeks. This is no time to go, oh, woof, we got this done. This is a time where the candidate and the campaign is desperately wanting people to stay engaged, enthusiastic, calling their friends in other states that are battleground states, doing whatever they can to help, volunteering, and making sure that those registered voters become likely voters on Harris's side of the equation.
Well, and Claire, that the likely voters are become Harris voters, right? It's both.
It's both.
It's turning out the low propensity voters to turn them into voters, and that's usually a lot of young voters, right, who may have gone off to college since they were paying attention over the summer, making sure they're registered where they're going to be in November, and then doing that final bit of persuasion. I want to show you, Claire, how our friend and colleague Steph Rule made an argument very effectively with someone who describes himself as undecided.
It's not too much to ask Kamala, say, are you for a Palestinian state if Hamas is going to run that state?
Okay.
Yes or no?
And let's say you don't like her answer. Are you going to vote for Donald Trump?
No, I'm not.
Kamala
I just said I'm not going to vote for her.
Harris is not running for perfect. She's running against Trump. We have 2 choices. And so there are some things you might not know her answer to. And in 2024, unlike 2016 for a lot of the American people, we know exactly what Trump will do, who he is, and the kind of threat he is to democracy.
I don't know.
So it's unclear to me how there could be an informed...
The problem that a lot of people have with Kamala is we don't know her answer to anything, okay?
But you know his answer to everything.
And that's why I would never vote for him, and people shouldn't vote for him. But people also are expected to have some idea of what the program is of the person you're supposed to vote for. You're just not supposed to say, well, you have to vote for Y because X is this, that, and the other. Let's find out a little bit more. And I don't think it's a lot to ask her to sit down for a real interview as opposed to a puff piece in which she describes, like, her feelings of growing up in Oakland with nice lawns.
Then I would just say to that, when you move to Nirvana, give me your real estate broker's number and I'll be your next door neighbor. We don't live there.
You know, Claire, at some point, Dick Cheney knows enough about what Kamala Harris's policies are, and I know him pretty well. He cares a lot about national security policy. Liz Cheney cares an awful lot about national security policy. She knows enough about what Kamala Harris's policies are. So do Adam Kinzinger and Jeff Duncan, and lifelong Republican and McCain ally Mayor Giles of Arizona. I mean, this to me doesn't feel like it's about what people like that say it's about.
Yeah, listen, I think Kamala Harris has been in public life for a long time. Kamala Harris has set out her positions on some very important issues like housing and affordability issues and food and groceries. She certainly has stated her policies on how important the climate change issue is. And by the way, she has been very clear about what her position is in reproductive health freedom, whereas does Bret Stephens, does that guy know what Trump is going to do on that issue? He changes every 10 minutes on what he's saying about how he will treat women's essential freedom in terms of controlling her own body. And that's the other thing. It just drives me crazy, these Republicans saying, well, it's his policies. He can't put 3 sentences together about his policies. He gets a question about manufacturing in Michigan, and he goes on 10 minutes about countries that have a nuclear weapon. It's like, what? I mean, he isn't cogent about his policies, and I'm not sure these people even know what his policies are. All I know about his foreign policy is he loves dictators. That's all I know.
Well, and David Jolly, Bret Stephens cares a lot about foreign policy. There's not a single person who saw Donald Trump in the sit room who's voting for him again. There's not a single person who saw Donald Trump in the tank briefings where the Pentagon briefed him on operations and crises who's voting for him again. Former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, gave a fiery speech saying that in America we don't swear an oath to a king or a dictator. We pledge an oath to the Constitution. There is not one person who saw him up close in a military or national. General Kelly, who was his chief of staff, said that he's the, quote, most damaged person he's ever seen in his life. Rex Tillerson, who was his Secretary of State, called him a moron. Bob Corker, Senate former chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said that the West Wing resembled adult daycare. You find me anyone who thinks that Donald Trump is a good bet on anything related to U.S. national security, and I'll send you a box of donuts.
Nicole, say that all again. So louder, please. That's exactly, I think, the point that Stephanie Ruhle was trying to make in her exchange there, which is we now know Donald Trump's view of the world, his view of the country. We know his leadership. And for many people, they see him as a danger to constitutional order, constitutional norms, and to, frankly, the order on the world stage. And look, I think if I didn't see the entire segment, so if Bret was being critical of Vice President Harris unduly, then he should be criticized. But I do think this is also an area where sometimes it's easy to hold Vice President Harris to a standard of perfection that she can't meet. She's not a perfect candidate. She came into this race 45 days ago. Some of her positions have changed, and there are questions that she hasn't answered. But what we know is the value set she brings to the office, both for domestic policy and her view of the international order, her willingness to protect the constitutional norms, her willingness to protect personal freedoms, her willingness to fight for an opportunity economy for all people. We know her record with the Biden administration, helping lead a post-pandemic recovery that's the envy of the world. We know that the Biden-Harris administration has restored respect for the country on the world stage. Are there questions she hasn't answered? Of course there are. But to hold her to a standard of perfection, we're failing the real choice test here, which is what Stephanie Ruhle was trying to point out there, which is we know the danger that Donald Trump is. And I think where we see that reflected in the NBC poll, what fascinates me is the first question, are we going in the right direction or wrong direction? 65% of the country says we're going in the wrong direction. It's like 65 to 28 maybe. But the fascinating thing is within that poll, voters see Vice President Harris as the change agent. And she is. There's no faking this. Donald Trump, this is his third time as the major party nominee. We've seen him as president. He's not a change agent. Vice President Harris, this is her first time as a presidential nominee who's offering her view of the world. The American people see that as change, and they say that is the change we want, particularly compared with Donald Trump.
Eddie, how do you see the contest and the conversation about the contest?
Well, I thought that Stephanie was engaged in an interesting pedagogical moment with Bret, right? And the question was, okay, if it's the case that she doesn't hold these positions, are you going to vote for Donald Trump? Right? So part of what we see with Bret is that there's this kind of worry that Kamala Harris is going to turn out to be a liberal. Perhaps she is. But does it follow from that fact that you can't not vote for her because your identity is so constituted as a conservative that you're willing to hand over the country to someone like Donald Trump? And that's what she was trying to say to them. You can't make her into you. She's not. Her policies are not going to be aligned with Project 2025. Her projects are not going to be aligned with moderate Republicans or so. She is who she is, and we can begin to detail that over the course of her career. We can't morph her into something else. But the question for the coalition, the broad coalition, is that she is who she is, and Donald Trump is who he is. Where do you land?
I think the other thing is, for them, it's about them.
Of course. Exactly.
Because there is a voter, I think Mitch McConnell and Bill Barr are the same kind of, and I don't know, I mean, Bret's made clear he's not going to vote for Trump. So Bret Stephens, and I don't want to pick on Bret Stephens, but I do think he gave voice to this thing that's out there. if you care about things like judges or foreign policy, then you must care about the process that appoints judges and confirms them. You must care about the limits of presidential power and of the State Department. And the thing about Trump is that if you care about the things you think you care about, or you go on a TV show and say you care about, Brett was making clear that he wants to understand our positions in the Middle East. It's something he writes about regularly, and I trust that he cares about that deeply. I know he does. If you care about that, what you're saying is, I'm not going to vote for Trump, but I'm not going to help defeat the person who would literally be the political version of Russian roulette when it comes to the issues that I care about most.
Absolutely right. There's nothing that I probably agree with in terms of Liz Cheney, in terms of policy. Probably zero, negative zero in some ways. But she and I agree on the background conditions that allow us to disagree.
Correct.
That's the key.
That's the point.
That's the point. And it seems to me that those persons who are using policy as a proxy for something much deeper, right? There are some folks who believe that if they vote for a Democrat, somehow they've cut against the grain of who they take themselves to be.
Right.
Right. And so part of what we have to do is to unpack what policy is actually, what the demand for policy details is actually standing in.
Well, because, and this comes back to where Claire and I started, and where David, like, it's about making registered voters likely voters. It's about making likely voters Harris voters. It's about people who don't like Trump, but say they care about things deeply, to understand that if you care about things deeply, the only one that keeps us a functioning democracy is Harris. We have so much.
Harris up in the polls. Now, remember, a national poll does not reflect what will happen in the election, but it does show us something. The national election will ultimately be decided by the states in the Electoral College system. That's why, like Hillary Clinton, you could be up in the national poll and still lose. But here's what I'm going to show you. The new NBC poll does have Harris up 5, far better than Biden's position a few months back, and it's driving headlines and buzz for Harris in politics, certainly online. The spread is still within the margin of error. And in the states that matter, as we showed you last week, things are largely a statistical tie. But what national polls can help reveal is big shifts in sentiment, especially when it's current. So instead of asking just how people might vote in the future in 5 or 6 weeks if they vote early, you can measure how the nation feels right now. And that's where there's really good news for Harris. There is a huge, unusually large jump in favorable views of Harris since she became the nominee. So the poll is asking, how do you feel today? And a lot more people today are feeling good about her. In fact, it's the largest such increase in decades, as Kornacki and Welker reported on the new Meet the Press.
This is the largest increase that we have seen for any politician since George W. Bush in the wake of the September 11th attacks on this issue.
Absolutely, Kristen. I mean, we were seeing numbers like this for years for Kamala Harris. Now you're seeing a very different story.
Many more Americans right now have a more favorable view of Harris. And pollsters note how remarkable a shift that is, going back to the surge in approval for President Bush and the historic demonstration of unity after the 9/11 attack. That's when Bush's favorability surged, partly because people felt favorably towards him and his response, and partly because of a longer and documented rally around the flag effect. So historians and pollsters note it is rare for the public to suddenly just like a prominent politician way more than they used to, because they already know that person and views tend to be more baked in. The 2001 example reflects that external event and response. With all that in mind and what Kornacki just said there, here are Harris's numbers. She had a 32% favorability in July, which roughly reflects the sloping blue curve that you see of where she'd been. And that was her role of VP. 1 out of 3 is not a great benchmark for winning a national election, if 32% or so is 1 out of 3 people thinking of you favorably. But then you have this jump. Look at that huge jump to 48%. And that is about 50% higher than that prior number, or a raw 16-point surge, one of the largest shifts in decades for any politician. So that's the big news tonight. The Harris campaign is happy about it, while still cautioning people nothing is set yet. But why is Harris rising in ways we have not seen in decades? In my report right now for you, I'm going to show why the answer actually has some layers and why it may explain the race that we're in right now, the current state of the race, and even where we're headed. So first, within the Democratic Party, there was a shockwave, swapping out a president with fading numbers for the new VP. And the party managed to do so, and I know you know this because you follow the news, they did so without any big primary or long jockeying public process. And that has clearly energized and united both the party, Democrats, and anti-Trump forces who might not be Democrats, independents, or moderates, who were not sold on Trump or opposed Trump, but were also concerned about Biden. The numbers show an embrace for Harris as that new alternative. And then, I said layers, the second layer may be how people are viewing Harris now in a new role. And here's what we can tell you. The people like her in this role. Being the nominee and the party leader taking on Donald Trump is different from being a deferential, deliberately smaller, quieter role of understudy or vice president to the president. And by playing that role well, many experts say Harris had to dim her shine. And that's literally the term that some historians and strategists use, citing an ancient precept that in political struggles, you never outshine the master. Always make those above you feel completely superior. In your desire to please and impress them, do not go too far in displaying your talents, or you might accomplish the opposite, inspiring fear and insecurity in them. Make your masters appear more brilliant than they are, and you will attain the heights of power. And that's not just a tip. I am quoting from the #1 law, the very first law in the 48 Laws of Power, a best-selling history and strategy book by Robert Greene, who we actually cited and hosted on this program before. The lesson applies to anyone biding time for higher office, certainly a vice president, but it dates back centuries. There are ancient strategy teachings from Machiavelli to Galileo, and how they carefully paid tribute to superiors or financial backers in the Medici family, always making their accomplishments subservient to whoever was more powerful. Here's the author discussing the lesson along with 50 Cent, who later co-authored a book with Greene and applied it to entertainment, where you know competition is fierce and how you cannot outshine your sponsor.
Law number 1 was always like the most important one to me. Never outshine the master.
You know the laws of power, you never outshine the master. Mm-hmm. You see what I'm saying? Like I even had that conversation and said it to Drake. Mm-hmm. I said, don't ever go over or be past Wayne in conversation, because it'll hurt you. Because then if you got somebody that's actually over you in your chain of command, you always like that.
Chain of command. Understand it, or you may not survive it. That's 50, that's Greene, other political writers. They're not saying they invented these power laws, rather that they've studied and applied them. And if it all sounds familiar, it is a tale and fable as old as time.
When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
I took away your fear, and I showed you a path. You are my greatest student.
Always two there are. No more, no less. A master and an apprentice.
If you are the apprentice, you have to know how to be a good apprentice and not think you're jumping ahead to becoming the master. Now, today, we see Harris as the boss, in the prime position. She's a dominant figure in the Democratic Party. She started this week by seizing control, challenging Trump to a debate that he's running from, making him respond to her and her perceived win at the last debate. And that is the Harris in the role that we are seeing many more Americans now like, quite literally. They're responding positively to her in this role as the boss in charge, which is a shift from her past vice presidential role, and it's a shift people are noticing.
Please welcome Kamala Harris. Everybody is saying it. You all have said it. I know you have. It seems to us that something happened to you the moment President Biden, stepped aside and withdrew his candidacy, that a veil or something dropped and you just stepped into your power.
If somebody breaks in my house, they're getting shot.
Yes, I hear that. I hear that.
Probably should not have said that.
But
my staff will deal with that later.
Yeah.
I'm just smiling from ear to ear, Oprah. I have never felt this much joy and optimism in a campaign in a long time.
When your adversaries will try and turn your strength into a weakness, don't you let them. Don't you let them. I find joy in the American people. I find joy and optimism.
Here at the Democratic National Convention, the energy is all about joy, change, joy, and some sweet dance moves.
Kamala Harris. What's up? Good debate.
As the saying goes, if you got something to say, say it to my face.
Harris is the boss. She's in the spotlight, which she earned by knowing when to stay out of it and defer, given the important but secondary role that she took as a dutiful VP. For our report tonight, it's also worth seeing the evidence of how different it was when she was in that other role, Vice President to Biden, applying that power law and supporting the administration in that more conventional role.
Just today, President Biden announced record job growth. From the beginning, the president has been very direct and clear about our perspective. And I can think of no one more committed to achieving our collective goals than President Joe Biden. President Biden set an ambitious goal. Today's numbers reflect the point that President Biden has made many times. America's economy is strong.
And what's the message to Iran?
Don't.
As President Biden said, just don't.
Exactly. One word. Pretty straightforward.
You can almost see and hear the difference, and that is what the law would teach, because that was the role she was in. Just as if you are a lawyer advocating a case, it's different than if you get appointed to become a judge. Anyone can relate to this at a certain level when you have a role or a job. It could be parent or soccer coach. It could be vice president of your company or CEO of your company. Harris maintained that stance even and especially when it was difficult. Consider those moments after Biden's debate performance, which we now know led to the shift in her rise. In those first hours that night after the debate, Harris did not waver at all. She stepped into the heat for interviews, including one on this network that night. She was talking to our colleague Rachel. And she was as loyal as ever, as the role demands. And if others were already discussing the perhaps remote, perhaps looming possibility of her becoming the replacement, becoming the master rather than the apprentice, she did not engage in any of that, not one iota that night or in the weeks ahead, let alone try to outshine the president. And a contrast that we live through right now. The former President Trump and his vice president, who couldn't even keep it together through the duration of their term, which ended with a failed illegal insurrection and coup. So say nothing of the larger point that, of course, Mike Pence doesn't support Donald Trump right now. She followed the law of power, and now she is surging with more power than anyone else in the party, including, in the political sense, the president who she dutifully served until she came into this view. And most striking of all, the American public is warming and welcoming her in this role.
Okay, let's talk about Janet Jackson's escapade. And no, not the song. When the singer was asked about the prospect of America electing a black woman president, she said of Harris, quote, "Well, you know what they supposedly said? She's not black." That's what I heard, that she's Indian. Her father's white. That's what I was told. I was told that they discovered her father was white. Yeah, that's not true. But those words do echo Trump saying that Harris magically turned black. And yet it gets worse. When Jackson was later pressed whether she thinks America is prepared to see Harris in office, she said, "I think either way it goes is going to be mayhem." Either way. Jackson's comments generated outrage online until a credited producer on her upcoming documentary walked it back. Before that person was seemingly fired, leaving it unclear whether Ms. Jackson still believes that Kamala Harris isn't black and really is willing to tell her billions of fans that there's no difference between Harris and Trump. It's a weird sequence of events, but Jackson is not alone. There's a host of celebrities who have made bizarre comments in actual support of Trump, who has long depended on endorsements from celebrities and Manoverse influencers, mostly because reputable experts and political figures have largely abandoned him. Still, the reality is that all campaigns want celebrity endorsements. Analysis from Harvard University's Ash Center shows it works. And it's, quote, incredibly powerful when centered around calls to action like registering voters or poll worker signups. And it is worth noting, for those counting, when it comes to celebrities, VP Harris has a massive list. And it's really a list, up to and including Oprah, who might be the biggest endorsement get of all. Trump, on the other hand, has a C list, although he does have the parents of some A-listers to keep Hulk Hogan and Kid Rock company. Joining me now is Alencia Johnson, former senior advisor to the 2020 Biden-Harris campaign and author of Flip the Script, The Everyday Disruptor's Guide to Finding Courage and Making Change. I love that idea. I love that book idea. Alencia, thanks for being here. Let's start with, I want to go back to Janet Jackson, because I originally didn't want to really do this story because I'm really not trying to embarrass Janet Jackson. I just don't, I'm a big fan of hers. I grew up listening to her. But I think about the power of her. I was just at Essence Fest this year. She performed. Her fan base is massively Black women. Black women all around the world are her core base. And if she is this subject to misinformation and disinformation, I feel like she actually does have the power to spread that disinformation and misinformation. And that winds up disempowering Black voters, Black women voters in particular. What do you make of it?
Well, look, we know that disinformation and misinformation spreads rampant in Black communities, and the way in which we engage them is actually through a lot of culture mechanisms. Not everybody is, well, I like to think everybody's watching us, Joy, but a lot of people aren't watching cable news in the way that we think they are to get some of their political messaging. And as you mentioned, Janet Jackson has a huge fan base. Look, I was a Janet Jackson fan before I was a Beyonce Beehive member, right? She also has talked about racism and sexism and discrimination in her music. I mean, all of the Jacksons have, right? And so I think it is great for us to talk about it because people are a little bit disappointed. And this is an example of, to your point, how fast this information spreads rampant and how it's so important for us to combat it everywhere, especially in the digital space where pop culture and entertainment spreads a lot faster than truth and news.
Yeah, and the thing is that these celebrities, they have a power, and we were talking about this on the call earlier, is what is the power of celebrities? Like, how do campaigns really use them? And my take, just from the campaign side, is they don't necessarily make somebody who didn't want to vote for candidate A vote for them, but they can make someone who is open to it register, actually, or sign up to vote, or go out and early vote, or just commit, right? They can get people to commit. But when they're actually just being messengers on, like, politics and policy, let me just let you listen to what John Legend had to say about that.
I think fans and audiences should be careful about wanting us to weigh in on everything because honestly, no, the depth and the breadth of understanding necessary to contribute meaningfully to the conversation is actually just not there for most artists. And you can't really blame them. This is not what they do every day, you know? Like, they're musicians, they're actors, they're in the public eye, and you want them to use that platform for good, but also you want them to do it with a sense of understanding and knowledge and wisdom and connection to activists and organizers and experts. And everybody's just not able to do that.
Alencia, you're actually teaching a course on this. How do we get that balance right in politics?
Yeah, look, my first actual political job was doing surrogate communications work for Obama's re-election campaign, working with a lot of celebrities to refine their messaging. Because what we find is that oftentimes it's not the message, it's the messenger that will, to your point, get voters from the couch to the ballot box or get people who are going to vote to actually start organizing and mobilizing. And I agree somewhat with what John Legend has said. And what I have found in working with the entertainment industry and a lot of my jobs is that celebrities, yes, they're artists, but they are also people first, right? There are issues that they care about, whether it's reproductive rights, racial justice, and a lot of times, particularly marginalized voices, will use their art as a form of protest and amplifying the message. If we look at last year, Hip Hop 50, hip hop was birthed out of a protest movement, from Fight the Power to F the Police to UNITY to all of the things that Meg Thee Stallion and Latto have said about these abortion restrictions. They are using their art as a form of not only protest and education, but galvanizing. And the other thing I'll say, too, Taylor Swift endorsed the night of the debate. Well, Vote.org saw almost 30,000 voter registrations within 24 hours of that endorsement.
Yeah.
That is the power of celebrity. So they're not helping people decide on who they're going to vote for. They're helping people decide that they are actually going to vote.
Yeah, it's interesting because, we didn't get a chance to talk about it, but there's the risk in it, too. I mean, Nikki Jim getting said about him, she's hot by Donald Trump is like, and he's now getting like just pilloried by his fans. But meanwhile, on the Democratic side, they're like waiting on Bad Bunny. They're like, come through Bad Bunny, because it can really help us with Latino voters. So everybody wants the celebrities, and they do help in certain ways. Alencia Johnson, thank you so much.
4 years after Donald Trump left the White House, we are still learning new details about his efforts to weaponize the federal government. Still learning more details. This weekend, the New York Times reveals how Trump stunned aides in the Oval Office back in 2018, telling them that, quote, if Attorney General Jeff Sessions would not order the department to go after Hillary Clinton and James Comey, the former FBI director, of course, Mr. Trump would prosecute them himself. Times reporter Michael Schmidt broke it down even further.
The President of the United States said that he wanted to turn himself into a prosecutor. He wanted to use the powers of the federal government to investigate and go after his perceived rivals, enemies, and critics.
So in this piece, Schmidt also says that White House lawyers wrote Trump a long memo explaining that no, he couldn't legally start a prosecution himself. That's not how it works. But they were reportedly so concerned about Trump trying that they smuggled copies of their memo out of the White House so they'd have a record of their efforts to restrain him. And despite concerns by his own White House lawyers, clearly big concerns, his loyalists in the Department of Justice still moved forward. And they did go after people Trump hated. People like Clinton, Comey, John Kerry and even former aides who turned against him, like John Bolton and Omarosa. They were all investigated. Trump attacked reporters and members of the media all the time. We all saw this happen publicly. And of course, the Justice Department at the time took it upon themselves to go after the phone and email records of reporters he didn't like. Trump's aides say his pressure to go after enemies was constant and relentless. Former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton told The Times that, quote, when Trump says things like this, he's serious about it. I know from experience that he constantly voiced the idea, and it's something he will come back to until it gets done. But it could have been even worse. I mean, at least some of Trump's worst impulses, some of them were stymied by some officials at the White House and Justice Department. But what if he wins re-election and he had some kind of plan to take out those guardrails? As Times columnist Ezra Klein writes this week, that is what Project 2025 was actually meant to be. It's an effort to build a deep state of Trump's own. Behind the policy playbook sits a database of around 20,000 applicants ready to be part of the next Trump administration. And that database is still growing. The point here is Trump doesn't even need to officially order things to happen. He didn't in all those cases I mentioned. He just needs to put his loyal cronies in positions where they know if he muses about something, it means they should act. And that makes the staffing of the Department of Justice, a historically independent agency that makes their own decisions, even more important. So if Trump does win, what's the Democrats' plan to prevent him from fully weaponizing it? Luckily, I have the perfect person to ask. Congressman Jamie Raskin is standing by, and he joins me next.
It's a plan to upend Democratic government as we know it, and it involves politicizing the federal workforce and gutting the professional civil service, weaponizing the Department of Justice against political rivals and the people.
That's Congressman Jamie Raskin. Of course, you all know him, the ranking Democrat on the House Oversight Committee, talking about Project 2025. The thing is, thanks to this brand new reporting in the New York Times I just talked through, we can see very clearly that there was plenty of weaponizing going on in the first Trump term. Of course there was. But if he wins this November, he now has a blueprint that will let him go much, much further. And Congressman Jamie Raskin joins me now. It's great to see you. I mean, I just went through some of the New York Times reporting. You have a lot of thoughts on this. And one of the things that really stuck out to me in this reporting that I wanted to ask you specifically about is this quote in there. Quote, there is no record of the inquiries and other actions coming about as a result of a formal signed order from Mr. Trump. Instead, he repeatedly signaled what he wanted publicly and privately, leaving no doubt among subordinates. I mean, what's scary about that is that it's just him musing about something. It's not looking for the internal memo. It's people just running with it. And if he staffs the Department of Justice with his loyalists, it could be far worse. But, I mean, what do you make of that? What did you make of that reporting? And what keeps you up at night about all of this?
Well, like all good mob bosses, Donald Trump would make his intentions very clear, both through public statements and private intentions. He might not commit it to a memo, but it was very clear he wanted James Comey, the FBI director, to go after Hillary Clinton and actually to prosecute her. The whole lock her up thing was not just some sort of political whimsy. That was real. And when Comey refused to recommend prosecution going forward to prosecute Hillary Clinton, then he turned on James Comey and said he should be investigated by the IRS. He should be prosecuted. He would do it himself if he had to, and so on. And, you know, you begin to see that in Donald Trump's paranoid worldview, vengeance really is the substance of politics. That's really what it's all about, going on vendettas against perceived political adversaries and enemies. And it's amazing the people who are on that list, James Comey, Andrew McCabe, of course. Everybody knows about Michael Cohen. He's a private counsel for many years who was willing to do anything for Donald Trump. And then Donald Trump wants to bring the full wrath of the Department of Justice and the federal government down on Michael Cohen to keep him from exercising his First Amendment rights, and saw to it, presumably, that Michael Cohen end up in solitary confinement for a couple of weeks. Now, if he would do this kind of thing to the director of the FBI, the deputy director of the FBI, his own private counsel, imagine what he would do to just any ordinary citizen out there who dares to take a stand against Donald Trump. So when he says dictator day one, everybody's got to take him at his word. He really means that, and he will feel as if he's made his intentions clear, all the more justified. And let's not forget that the United States Supreme Court, in its Roberts Court wisdom, has now said that the President of the United States has immunity from prosecution for actual crimes committed as President of the United States if they are perceived to be within the core functions of the presidency, under the rubric of the core functions, even if they are felony offenses. So he will be totally unbridled.
We don't like to play a lot of Donald Trump clips around here, but to your point, we do have to take him at his word, and it's important for people to hear. And he's at a rally right now in Pennsylvania, and I do want to play you something he said just moments ago, because I think it's important for people to hear it and for people to understand what he means by it.
We're going to go after anybody that gets caught cheating on the election. We're going to go after them harder than anyone's ever been sought before. Because these people are really a threat. They are a threat to democracy. The Democrats are a threat to democracy.
I mean, he said similar things before, but it expands, and he's saying more of it. They are a threat to democracy. What is your reaction? But what should people take from that?
Well, it's a remarkable clip, and I saw three things there. One, of course, it was a projection of his entire approach to this election. He's not campaigning. They're not canvassing and going door to door. They're not trying to enlarge the MAGA coalition. They're trying to figure out ways to nullify votes, as they did on January 6, 2021. They're trying to suppress the vote, repress the vote, control the election. They've got a bag of dirty tricks that are, beginning to be taken out of the bag right now. The second thing is it's a threat. So it's a clear attempt to intimidate people. We saw what they did to election workers in 2020, and they are trying to create as much fear as possible across the country in people who are just administering our elections, the people who make democracy functional in America. But the third thing is, we know based on all the reportage now, that was a promise. He means to follow through on that. He has advertised the names and the faces of those of us who were on the January 6th Select Committee already, saying that we're wanted for various imaginary crimes floating around in his head. But now he's saying that basically everybody who participates in the election will be subject to his vengeance. And he has said he will be an instrument of revenge for his followers. So we've got to take him seriously here.
We got to take him seriously. It's a perfect place to end. Congressman Jamie Raskin, I always love talking to you. I always learn things. I always think of
being 6 weeks out means we now have a pretty good idea of what the campaigns are going to look like for this election, the sort of character of how each side is going to run their candidate for the presidency. So we know, for example, that Republicans are going to keep trying to win the election this year by gaming the system, by trying to change the administration of the election, trying to change how the votes are cast and counted. Today, the pro-Trump majority on the Georgia State Election Board met again and pushed through yet more changes in that crucial swing state, even after they were just warned by the state's Republican Attorney General's office, the state's Republican Secretary of State's office last week. They were just warned that they're doing things they're really not allowed to do. But nevertheless, today they announced more. Today they announced they're going to investigate 8 different counties in Georgia for having rejected mass Republican challenges to individual voter registrations, voter challenges aimed at taking voters off the rolls. The state election board, with its pro-Trump majority, is now going to investigate counties that didn't do enough to throw voters off the rolls. They also today announced a whole new plan, 6 weeks out from the election, to mandate that photos of every ballot should be put online immediately following the election. We're 6 weeks out, and people are already, the ballots have already gone out, and this is yet another new rule they want. Local officials, and again, statewide officials like the AG and the Secretary of State, have said now on the record that what the state election board in Georgia is doing is crazy. The word used by the Secretary of State's office was absurdity. But hey, they're going for it. If maximum chaos is what they want in that critical swing state, apparently maximum chaos is what they are determined to get. So we've got eyes on the sort of rolling disaster in Georgia. We're also keeping eyes on Nebraska, where Republicans in the Trump campaign are trying to make a last-minute change to the rules in Nebraska that have been in place for more than 30 years. Republicans are apparently afraid that Kamala Harris may win one electoral vote from a congressional district in Omaha, which is the state's biggest city. So they are now, at the very last second, trying to change the rules in the state of Nebraska to block her from being able to win that single electoral vote. Republican U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, you might have seen, has been in Nebraska trying to talk Republicans there into doing it. Today, a single Republican state senator said that he was not going to go along with this plan, that it didn't seem right or fair to him to do it this way, especially at the last minute. The reason I say we are watching Nebraska in the wake of that news today is because, naturally, once this one Republican state senator came out and said he wasn't going to go along with it, thus apparently scuttling the Republicans' plans to make this last-minute change, Donald Trump himself is now singling out that one individual Republican state senator, singling him out by name, attacking him online, blaming him, putting pressure on him, which is exactly the kind of tactics Trump brought to bear in 2020 when he singled out individual local Republican officials in places like Michigan and Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania and all of these swing states, telling them essentially to do his bidding or else, or face the consequences. That kind of name and shame intimidation from Trump alone and from the legions of his followers who take what they think is the appropriate action on command when he singles out someone by name for them to target. That is a rerun from what we saw from Trump in 2020, which did not ultimately work to throw out the election results in 2020, but it did ruin the lives of a whole lot of low-level officials and state officials who he targeted by name to try to bend them to his will, right? It transformed their lives. It transformed the lives of their family members, and all in very bad ways. But that's how Trump politics works. That's how he operates. And if we have learned anything as a country from seeing previous iterations of his intimidation tactics brought to bear on low-level, obscure, or state-level officials, if we've learned anything from seeing this happen before, we should have learned that the way you stop his intimidation tactics from working is by opposing them, by recognizing when that's what he's doing, and by overtly standing up for these people when they are attacked, making sure that the only people who get in trouble in a Trump-initiated confrontation like this are the people who make the threats, the people who try to intimidate and coerce public officials into doing what they otherwise would not do. When Trump singles out individual, particularly Republicans, but individual local, municipal, county, state officials like that to get them to do what he wants around the election, we know, yes, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, to get them to bend to his will, but we know that it also ruins their lives. We've seen this over and over and over again, and that is why the intimidation tactics that he uses work, because it makes people afraid. The way for us as a country to stop that is to stand up for people who are targeted in this way and make sure that anybody threatening or trying to coerce them gets busted for it. We did not do enough of that in 2020. We have to do it in 2024 as part of defending our democracy. The Washington Post this weekend front-paged a story about what they called the, quote, turbulent phase that Trump's campaign has entered into for this last 6 weeks of the campaign. They described Trump's behavior in the campaign right now as, quote, impulsive and impetuous. The Post noted in its story, quote, in a single 24-hour span at the end of last month, for example, Trump amplified a crude joke about Vice President Harris performing a sex act. He falsely accused her of staging a coup against President Biden. He promoted tributes to the QAnon conspiracy theory. He hawked digital trading cards. He became embroiled in a public feud with staff and officials at Arlington National Cemetery, all in 24 hours. And that is true. The Post goes on to describe gently, I think, what they call Trump's, quote, policy incoherence at this point in his campaign as well. And to be clear, along with the sort of just erratic behavior and outrageous behavior, the policy coherence really is off the charts, right? I mean, there's inexplicably high levels of interest and appetite in the mainstream press for reporting on Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as if they are similar kinds of cats, right? As if they are normal competing candidates that we can assess using the same kind of terms. But they're not the same kind of cats, right? They are not the same kind of candidates. They are not doing the same kinds of things. For example, like here's Kamala Harris getting the endorsement of 700 retired military and national security officials, while here's Trump promising that if he's president, he's going to find where California is hiding its huge secret faucet that they use to dump all the rainwater into the ocean. And if he's president, he's going to find the handle on the gigantic faucet and turn it the other way. It takes a whole day to turn the handle, he says. So problem solved. Everybody will have all the water that they want. Okay, well, here's Kamala Harris promising a child tax credit and saying how she'd pay for it. Here, on the other hand, is Donald Trump saying he's going to abolish the Department of the Interior for some reason. Nobody even bothered asking him why. Why do you want to abolish the Department of the Interior? Here's Trump saying he wants to take away the broadcast licenses of news organizations that criticize him. Here's Trump saying he wants to put former President Barack Obama in front of a military tribunal. But Harris does want a child tax credit. Yet one of these things is not like the other. I mean, even if you go to the less outrageous stuff, I mean, Republicans in the House of Representatives just ignored Trump's demand to shut down the government before the election. They are going ahead with funding the government against his wishes. They are not going to bring about a government shutdown, even though he demanded one. That insult and rebuke to the Republican Party's leader would have led the news for days if this was a candidate who attracted normal political coverage. But instead, while Trump instead races toward Election Day, rolling out a new scam, some new money-making effort to squeeze money out of his fans almost every day. I mean, this alone is completely bizarre. Imagine Kamala Harris doing anything like this. But every day, there's the new Trump commemorative coin that he is selling to his supporters. This comes hot on the heels of Trump's new cryptocurrency venture, which he has rolled out with the help of a man who literally calls himself, quote, the dirtbag of the internet, and another man who is a self-proclaimed pickup artist. Here's the candidate's wife launching her own book this week, hot on the heels of the news that the majority of her campaign appearances this whole election cycle were ones for which she was personally paid hundreds of thousands of dollars. Here's his daughter-in-law, who he installed as the chair of the National Republican Party, nevertheless finding time in the home stretch of the campaign to drop a new single for her side hustle where she's a singer. None of these things, from the commemorative coin to the single, none of these things are raising money for the Trump campaign or the Republican Party. They're all just personal money-making gigs for him and his family that they are launching at the height of the campaign. Imagine if Kamala Harris was like rolling out a mortgage scam and some commemorative trinkets right now. Not for the campaign, but just to like get her and Doug some money. Trump, brought a 9/11 truther to the 9/11 commemoration on 9/11. And his staff really did shove an Arlington cemetery worker when she tried to stop them filming thumbs up, big grin campaign videos at grave sites. And no, apparently he's not got any sort of problem with the North Carolina Republican candidate for governor, who he endorsed and who he has celebrated as a candidate, no problem at all, not even after the reporting that the man literally calls himself a Nazi, praises Hitler, praises Mein Kampf, wants to take away women's right to vote, and wants to bring back slavery because, according to him, slavery was good. Imagine being a world leader from some other country, coming to New York for the United Nations this week, coming to the United States of America, fully briefed and cognizant that a presidential nominee in this country, in that situation, who can't even criticize or distance himself from a candidate who has said those things, a presidential nominee of one of the major parties has got essentially even odds right now of being elected president of the United States, president of the United States of America.
There's a lot going on, but I want to start tonight with the dumpster fire, that's the only way to call it, that is still raging in North Carolina. Because it's actually about more than one crazy guy. And believe me, he's definitely crazy if you've read any of the things he said. And it's also about more than one important swing state. And believe me, North Carolina is very important. But this really is a story about the corner the Republican Party has backed itself into. As I'm sure you've all heard by now, or probably wish you could unhear or unsee if you've been paying attention, Mark Robinson, the Republican nominee for governor in North Carolina, posted a whole lot of stuff on a porn site. He called himself a black Nazi, expressed support for reinstating slavery, and called MLK an effing commie. His words, not mine. That was all according to a very thorough report from CNN that came out just last week. Now, surprise, surprise, ever since then, Robinson has repeatedly denied making those comments. And what we heard from him today was just about as Trumpy as you can get.
We're in talks right now, everything up to legal counsel to take CNN to task for what they have done to us. We are going after them, okay? We are going to go after them for what they've done.
Threatening to sue a media organization for reporting on something you actually did. I wonder who he learned that trick from. So that's Mark Robinson's response. Now, when it comes to the rest of the Republican Party, not all of them, but many Republican leaders, we're seeing some flashes of what you would expect to see in the wake of a scandal like this. I mean, 4 of Robinson's top staff members resigned over the weekend. The Republican Governors Association is cutting off their spending, writing in a statement today, quote, "Our current media buy in North Carolina expires tomorrow, and no further placements have been made." That's all they said. So, yeah. Robinson is losing staff, and he's not getting any more money from the Republican Governors Association. None of that is a good sign for any campaign, to state the obvious. They're all but forfeiting this race for governor in North Carolina, which he was already losing before this. But here's the thing. Even as staff abandons him and the money dries up, no one is speaking up forcefully as to why those things are happening, even though it's quite obvious as to why those things are happening. There was no condemnation of anti-Semitism in those statements from staffers or the RGA, no denouncement of the self-proclaimed black Nazi comments, and there has been no denouncement of any of that from far too many leaders of the Republican Party. I mean, Donald Trump, who has absolutely zero self-control whatsoever, I think we can all agree on that, just spent the last few weeks waxing poetic about pets, who defends the indefensible every chance he gets. That guy did not mention Robinson once this weekend during a rally in North Carolina, of all places. His running mate, J.D. Vance, did manage to say something about all of this while really saying nothing at all.
Do you believe him that those were not his posts?
I don't not believe him. I don't believe him. I just think that you have to let these things sometimes play out in the court of public opinion.
I don't not believe him. I'm wondering if somebody wrote that down as a talking point for him. I don't know the backstory, but not to worry. J.D. Vance took another crack at it today in North Carolina.
What he said or didn't say is ultimately between him and the people of North Carolina. The people of North Carolina are going to make that decision. Now, look, I've seen some of the statements. I haven't seen them all. Some of them are pretty gross, to put it mildly. Mark Robinson says that those statements are false, that he didn't actually speak them. So I think it's up to Mark Robinson to make his case to the people of North Carolina that those weren't his statements, and I'm going to let him make that case. A sex scandal in North Carolina is between the lieutenant governor and the people of North Carolina.
A sex scandal? I mean, it wasn't a porn site, but there was no mention of the black Nazi stuff or the praising Mein Kampf stuff. None at all. And then the profile continued today with House Speaker Mike Johnson. When asked if he supports Robinson, a man who never misses a moment to talk about his faith and how important it is to him, a man who has spoken repeatedly out against anti-Semitism, said this, quote, "I'm not involved in the North Carolina governor's race. I got enough on my hands." Okay. And Senator Tom Cotton echoed that non-answer answer just yesterday.
Do you think that Trump should still support Mark Robinson in North Carolina?
I'll leave that to President Trump, and most importantly, I'll leave it to the people of North Carolina.
I mean, really? The guy applauds Mein Kampf on a porn site, and that's the best you can do? You knew you were going to be asked about it. Senator Lindsey Graham managed to somehow, though, outdo Tom Cotton.
I think what's going to happen here is that he deserves a chance to defend himself, Mark Robinson. The charges are beyond unnerving. If they're true, he's unfit to serve for office. If they're not true, he has the best lawsuit in the history of the country for libel.
I could go on, but I think I've made the point. What we're really watching here with this uncharacteristic silence from Trump and that cringeworthy caginess from all of those Republican allies is basically a pocket veto in real time. No, they're not saying they do support Robinson, but they're not saying they don't either. I mean, none of these leaders in the Republican Party have just flat out forcefully said what I think should be a layup of a response to all of this, and that is this. This is wrong. There is no place for bigotry, anti-Semitism, sexism, racism, hate, or any flirtation with Nazism of any kind in our party. That should not be hard to do for anyone. But none of them have said that. Because they can't say that. Because if they say that about Mark Robinson, then they have to say that about Donald Trump and J.D. Vance. If they speak out against the bigotry and hate that Robinson clearly stands for, then they're speaking out against the leader of their own party, too. That would require a level of political courage that, unfortunately, very few of them seem to possess. Now, just in the last few minutes, we learned that Georgia Governor Brian Kemp pulled his endorsement of Mark Robinson, so I guess there's that. There was so much happening today, we had to bring out the big table. Mark Leibovich and McKay Coppins are staff writers for The Atlantic. Gretchen Carlson is a journalist and co-founder of Lift Our Voices and has an amazing initiative we'll talk about, too. And Simone Sanders Townsend is the former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris and co-host of The Weekend right here on MSNBC. Okay, a lot happening. I just gave my take on the Mark Robinson news. Mark Leibovich, you never hold back. What is all of that? What does that tell you right now about the state of the Republican Party?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I mean, Donald Trump has introduced an ethic to here. I don't know if we call it an ethic, but whatever it is, it's you deny, you attack the media, you claim it's all made up, and then you never apologize. You never show any kind of courage. You never step back and do the decent thing. The problem there is the contagion, and you have people who know otherwise who have to go on TV and sound like idiots. I mean, a thinking person.
I think
cannot
that's a fair statement of what we just saw.
I mean, it's not just this case. It's everything, like J.D. Vance having to say that, well, we made up these stories, but it's okay because it's freedom of speech. Whatever it is. I mean, thinking people can actually make determinations about this and conclude that these are not people really fit to serve, and these are not answers that are acceptable to me. So that's what I think this is. I think it's more than just what's happening in North Carolina. It's a contagion.
McKay, I mean, so there are similarities. I mean, Herschel Walker, there's lots of examples, right? And there's similarities for a range of reasons. But this does feel slightly, I mean, Trump is at the top of the ticket. He's never silent about anything. Does this feel similar or different to you?
I think some of the anxiety that you put your finger on here in the Republican establishment, where they don't seem to know what they should say about this, stems from the fact that throughout the party, leaders do not know where the line is anymore for what their base will tolerate and what they won't, right? Part of this is the desensitizing effect that Donald Trump has had on the Republican electorate over the last 10 years. Part of it is you go back to 2015 when Donald Trump first came on the scene. That Republican Party was already in a kind of state of disarray. The Tea Party had upended the politics, had changed the litmus test. A lot of Republican politicians didn't know what they were supposed to say anymore to keep voters on their side. And I think that for the last, 9 or 10 years, basically at this point, they've been following Donald Trump's lead. And Donald Trump is not giving a clear indication about what to do with Mark Robinson. So Republican leaders don't know what to do about Mark Robinson. And that's where you get all the confusion that you just showed, from J.D. Vance all the way on down to local leaders in North Carolina.
I mean, it doesn't, Gretchen, it doesn't feel confusing, right? There are disagreements between the parties.
This would have never happened 8 years ago before Trump. I mean, Trump is the enigma here. So the question is, for these crazy candidates, do they win or do they lose? And most of the time, like Herschel Walker, they have lost. So Trump is Teflon. He has had no repercussions for the crazy crap that he says. Mark Robinson will likely lose as governor. But what does that do to Trump in North Carolina, which is the bigger question? Because North Carolina is an incredibly important state to Kamala Harris and to Donald Trump. My concern is that Trump is at the top of the ballot with Kamala Harris. And North Carolina also has a history of a split ticket. They voted for Trump last time, but they voted in a Democratic governor, right? So they have that history. So Robinson can lose. I'm not sure that that means that people don't still vote for Trump in North Carolina.